Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. I think let's go to Australia. I've never been to Australia, and it's about a high time, right? And I want to visit somebody. I'm going to call a friend, but he's an absolutely new friend because we've only met about 3 minutes ago on Zoom, and we're going to get acquainted. But I know a lot about him from over the years. He's been a very important person in the anti-nuclear weapons movement. So, and he lives in someplace in Australia. I'm going to find out in a second. And he lives with, you can see, a whole lot of books. Good morning, John Hallam, or good evening for me. And is it morning for you or what?
It's morning for me in a somewhat cold and locked down Sydney. So we all haven't left home for, oh my goodness, something like 4 months.
Okay.
So it's all a bit sort of, it's a bit grim and gloomy here compared to what you're normally used to Australia being like.
Yeah.
And of course that gives me more opportunity to work on the things I normally work on via Zoom, via the computer, than ever. So I've gone into a sort of a...
Well, I can attest to the fact that you're as productive as anybody I know, because almost every other day I get an email document from you, not just a little letter, but something you have circulated to obviously a worldwide list of activists. And it's always quite an astute kind of document. It's often sent to me by Bev DeLong in Toronto, or rather in Calgary, I believe, who seems to be a fan of yours, because she certainly circulates your and publicizes your work. So thank you, Bev, for introducing me.
Well, thank you, Bev. I didn't know you were doing that.
Yeah, she's very good about it. I think mostly to pugwash people. She's very active in pugwash on the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which she managed for a number of years. Anyway, so I got a document from you today, which I believe was written to address the UN General Assembly, which will be meeting, when is it, in November? Or
it starts meeting basically next month. First committee basically meets throughout October.
Oh, yes. I got it confused. I was thinking in terms of the NPT, which the NPT doesn't, review conference doesn't begin until about January, does it?
January, correct.
Yeah, okay.
I used to physically go to all of these things, and then COVID came, and of course that kind of put the kibosh on that. So I'm doing all of this electronically. But yeah, the last 2 letters, there were 2 letters to the General Assembly in fairly quick succession, and both of them were kind of filtered through the steering committee of the global No First Use campaign. There was a broader one on nuclear risk reduction, and then there was a bunch of talking points on no first use. But the bottom line really in both of these is, one, the risk of an accidental or otherwise apocalypse is as great or greater than it has ever been, including during the heights or the depths of the Cold War. And 2, there is a whole menu of not very exciting sounding, sometimes technical sounding, sometimes boring sounding measures, which are basically common sense measures that can be taken to make an accidental apocalypse less likely. And these include things like de-alerting. They include things like not having military exercises next to each other's borders with nuclear capable forces, which has happened quite a few times, and which NATO does against Russia with fairly regularity, and the Russians have been doing it back. And when you have two lots of exercises mirror imaged, then in the words of an American general who was asked what happens if something goes wrong, he said, "Look, I don't even want to think about that." Oh, he clearly had thought about it, and clearly wasn't exactly thrilled by what he thought about.
Yeah.
But anyway, my point was that there's a whole range of things that can be done to lower the risk of nuclear war. But the thing which Biden has talked about when he was vice president and when he was on the campaign trail was no first use.
Well, he didn't call it that, though. He called it sole purpose.
There are some versions of sole purpose that are not necessarily no first use, and that could turn out to be fairly ugly. But sole purpose, meaning the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, sort of ends up panning out as more or less the same as no first use. If nobody hits the button first, then, at least in theory, the button will never be hit and we won't have global thermonuclear war. Of course, things might get a bit mushroom shaped if, for example, somebody's radar system indicates that the other side has launched and it turns out to be a practice tape for World War III inserted into the main command computer, or sunlight reflecting off a particular unusual formation of high clouds directly over North Dakota that looked to Soviet surveillance satellites exactly like a bunch of launches. But still, if nobody hits the button first, then the button won't be hit.
Well, okay, look, the other thing that worries me in a way, one of the many things, is that somebody else might set off one and you wouldn't know where it came from. So you might retaliate against something that might not even been the guy who did it. Is there much attention given to the possibility that, some rogue might intentionally deceive or simply nobody really knows where it came from?
Well, indeed. And that extends also into the whole realm of cyberspace hacking. What if my computers indicate that the other side has launched, but actually someone's gotten into the computer and the computer is giving me misinformation? So all of those possibilities exist. And yes, there's a considerable literature on this stuff, most of which makes exceedingly depressing reading. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's fairly technical, and a lot of it is couched in generalities because we don't know exactly how specific surveillance systems, specific nuclear command and control systems actually do operate, because of course all that's classified.
Yeah. So
yes, these dangers are indeed very real. And as long as nuclear weapons are there, as long as we keep nuclear weapons in ready to launch status, then there is a significant risk of something going mushroom-shaped, and we've initiated basically the end of the world.
Okay, well, I'm sort of puzzled by the fact that the whole notion or the desirability of promoting no first use as a worldwide policy, that it is controversial. And I think maybe you can help me get clear about that. But because there are people I know who are very much on your side, I'm thinking, for example, Aaron Tovish, who's now just moved to the Philippines, and
Aaron is on my committee, so
right.
yeah. Aaron and I exchange emails on a multi-email a day basis. Yes,
Uh-huh.
so
Yes,
Aaron's a good mate.
yes, he is indeed. I've known him ages, and he has just moved there, and it's going to be very convenient to pair you up because he wrote me today and said, "Well, I can't be on a schmooze day because that means I would have to be up in the middle of the night because now that I'm living in the Philippines, I can't." We're different times of day. But I thought, well, I could probably put you and him together on a show because both of you are on more or less, at least
Yeah,
as
more or
daytime.
less the same. Yeah, and I mean that would be that would be very nice.
Yeah, if I thought about it early enough, I could have done it for this show because it would be
Yeah.
interesting to see what Aaron's take is on this. But now, next
Well, I mean,
tomorrow,
Aaron and I do work together very closely, and
yeah,
on I mean, all of these letters have got both our signatures on, but behind that, there will have been a fair amount of bouncing of the text
hmm
with input from a couple of retired diplomats. Alan Ware is
hmm
another person who I obviously work very closely with.
Now tomorrow, I'm going to be doing a talk show with Gary Seymour and Tariq Ralph. Now,
Right.
I don't know what Gary Seymour's position is, but I believe he was a very important nuclear weapons expert or official, really, in Obama's government. And of course, Tariq Ralph is in Vienna, and he's on the other side, as I understand it, of the uh, argument about no first use. And I did have a conversation with him a while back, but it'll be interesting to hear those two guys talk about no first use, among other things. Uh, so it would have been also fun to put you all together and see what
Well,
happened.
it would have, and I think we could have had a really terrific discussion. I'm a little bit puzzled by how anyone could be against anything, whether no first use, de-alerting, any of the measures that make the end of the world less likely. Now, none of these things are substitutes for the elimination of nuclear weapons, and they're not intended to be. But they are intended to ensure that in the short to medium term, we're all still here. And as long as nuclear weapons are held in particularly risky postures, that the real possibility of catastrophe remains.
Yes, yes.
And I mean,
And
you could talk to some of the people from the Doomsday Clock about this. Rachel Bronson is obviously someone I think about. And again, Rachel is someone who I've got a great deal of time for, and I think you really should interview her.
okay.
Rachel is strongly in favour of the no first use formulation. Sorry, the sole purpose formulation of no first use. But I mean, Rachel is very much concerned about the fact that not only do nuclear weapons continue to be there, but that the postures and policies that surround those weapons are more and more likely to encourage their actual use.
One happy event that makes me feel a little bit happier, and that is that when Putin and Biden got together, they did issue a reaffirmation of the position that Gorbachev and Reagan enunciated so long ago, that nuclear weapons, a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought, must never be fought. And they say that they're still committed to that point of view. I don't know whether that simply saying something like that really amounts to anything. I think that is, in fact, probably the basis for the critique of the no first use doctrine, because it is just a declaratory statement and doesn't necessarily carry through to any real difference, so that when push comes to shove, they might go ahead and use nuclear weapons anyway. But so do you think that a statement such as the Putin and Biden agreement is worth the paper it's written on, or whatever?
I think that it is helpful, and I mean, I might precede that by saying that we wrote a letter which was signed by 1,200 highly distinguished people, and this is kind of letter number 3, as it were. Oh God, and I also wrote a letter off my own to Biden a month before that. And in both of those letters, so you're looking at one which was a sort of a bit more wonky letter, essentially put together by Aaron and myself. And then the one with the 1,200 very distinguished people. So there were lots of former prime ministers and ambassadors, etc., etc. At least one general, but a number of ex-military. And in both of those letters, we said that it was both of which would have hit the Biden and Putin administrations 1 to 2 months before they had their meeting in Vienna, and that were explicitly focused on the meeting in Vienna. And we said that it's essential that you reiterate Reagan-Gorbachev. Now, I guess what you need to do is think, well, what if they hadn't reiterated Reagan-Gorbachev? What would you take away from that? Because it wasn't by any means certain, and we certainly were not certain, that they would take the slightest bit of notice of what we said, and that they might not have reiterated Reagan-Gorbachev. I'm inclined to think that a Trump administration would not reiterate Reagan-Gorbachev. Mm-hmm. So I think that it displays an intent not to hit the button, but then the question is, what do I follow that up with? What policies do I use to make sure that indeed nuclear war never takes place? Mm-hmm. So yes, it is one thing to recognise that having a nuclear war is a bad thing, and that's no small thing. Remember,
well, it should be the most obvious thing in the world.
The most obvious, absolutely, it should be. But you know, Ronald Reagan, in the early part of his administration, didn't recognise that nuclear war really would be the end of the world. It took a viewing of the day after to really get him into that position, and I'm quite sure that that's what it was. And to get him into the position where he was even willing to talk to Mr. Gorbachev and say that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So, I mean, I guess I'm saying this as well because, you know, I personally stuck my neck out for a number of years in the years before COVID, and every time I went to the UN, I would choose some ambassador's ear about, look, wouldn't it be a great idea if you would put up a first committee resolution simply reaffirming Reagan-Gorbachev? And often the response that I got was, yes, well, but what if the United States and Russia didn't vote for it? And that was a real consideration. That consideration has now gone out the window because the United States and Russia have reaffirmed that proposition. So it is important. Now,
excuse me for being a wet blanket, but I kind of worry about whether or not words are match deeds. And the thing that I fear most is that both sides, and I know more about the U.S. maybe than the Russian side, but that at least NATO has been developing, tactical nuclear weapon like things with this modernization program. It seems that some military people are trying to think of, well, can't we use nuclear weapons a little bit on the battlefield if we're really careful about what they're like or something? So they keep fiddling around with types of weapons that could only be of any value if you really were in a war and intended to use them in a battle. So tell me that this statement by Putin and Biden really is a disavowal of all of those elements of their various military postures.
No, it's not a disavowal of that. And you're quite right to be concerned about those things. It's a little bit like the way World War I started. Now, this is like a sort of a favorite obsession of mine, is the parallel between how World War I started and how World War III started. Nobody actually wanted to have World War I, but it happened.
Yeah.
So, yes, Reagan and Gorbachev, Putin and Biden can repeat till they're blue in the face, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. They might personally feel that a nuclear war would place their own lives in jeopardy, as indeed it would. They would be quite likely to die were that to happen. And a nuclear war can still take place because the fundamental changes in posture and policy haven't been made. It's just that if we don't have a consciousness that we'd like to avoid nuclear war, we won't even try to avoid nuclear war.
Yeah.
And the kinds of considerations that you're talking about, the possible use of tactical nukes and that kind of thing, all of that makes that kind of failure more likely. So yes, you're absolutely right to be concerned about those things. I'm deeply concerned about the possibility of war-fighting use of tactical nuclear weapons. And, I think that one of the most likely global flashpoints is probably the city of Kaliningrad, which bristles with intermediate range tactical Russian nukes. And there are NATO plans to attack Kaliningrad. Now, of course, if you attack Kaliningrad, what are they going to do with those tactical nukes? They're going to launch them.
Well, you said there are plans to attack.
They're going to incinerate Germany and the Czech Republic and my beloved country of Poland, where she is now. And maybe 100 million people will die in a couple of hours, and then World War III will be on.
When you say that there are plans to attack Kaliningrad, please fill me in. I'm not sure who's planning what.
I'm saying that NATO has said quite openly that they have military plans.
Well, okay, that to me, that's saying nothing more than the NATO has plans to attack Russia, which of course they do. They've had plans for every possible way of attacking Russia all these years. But I'm not quite sure why they would start with Kaliningrad.
It is surrounded on all sides by NATO countries. It's not contiguous with Russia. It's sort of like a little island in the middle of NATO, and is therefore seen as a thorn in NATO's side, etc., etc. So it would undoubtedly be the first place to go. But yes, it would. There's no question but that it would be the tripwire for World War III.
Okay.
But it would also mean the incineration of a large part of Europe.
Yeah. Okay. Now, maybe you can clarify two things. One is you say that in some ways no first use is the same as sole purpose, and maybe not. I've heard people sort of argue about whether it is the same or not, but I haven't heard the intricacies of the argument, and maybe it's worth enlightening me, and maybe it's not even worth talking about. But that is one thing that I'd like to get clarification. But the other thing is, I understand that when he was vice president and even under the Trump period, that Biden had said that he was in favor of no first use or this sole purpose thing. But then the question is, what would keep him from simply declaring it tomorrow morning? And why hasn't he? What are the constraints on a president for making a decision of that kind? My impression is from listening, I think Joe Cirincione was saying that Obama had really wanted to do a lot of nuclear disarmament and just couldn't do it because the powers of the Republicans and so on he couldn't do it. And maybe that's what the kind of thing that's limiting what Biden has been able to do, or what do you think?
Well, I'm sure that analysis is correct. I think that he has to keep his military happy. And at the moment, he's probably very concerned to keep General Milley happy. Now, not that I have a particular bone to pick with General Milley, far from it. I think that he was an island of relative sanity at a time when things are going completely crazy. But I'm sure that the military in general takes a fairly conservative view of this sort of thing, and yes, he will have to tread somewhat delicately. Now, I'm not him, and I don't know what compromises he might feel that he has to make. All I can do, all any of us can do, is to encourage him to make decisions that make nuclear war less likely. And I'm quite sure that deep in his heart, that is what he wants to do.
Now, today, a few hours ago, he had a press conference and announced something that I think made your ears flap, which is that there's a new, a very important, apparently, a new relationship with Australia, and that it's basically they didn't use the word China in the whole document or the whole report, but that it's really a concern for mutual military aid to intimidate or at least deter China from claiming, I believe, control of the South China Sea and prohibiting the Australian fleet from, or any commercial Australian vehicles from transiting the South China Sea. Tell me, and I also saw, I think it was on CNN, saying that now 63% of the Australians see China as a military threat or some sort of antagonist, whereas a few years ago it was like 12%. So things are going from bad to worse in terms of relationship. Of course, if you talk about stopping a war, the best way to stop a war is make sure you don't have any enemies. I mean, and it's kind of hard to do because some people are pretty hard to get along with, even in real life. So tell me what you think of this new agreement, which I believe entails the purchase of nuclear submarines by Australia.
The first question is whether Australia really needs submarines at all. It's a little hard to see what kind of role any sub, nuclear or otherwise, really plays in Australia's defence. Yes, they're good for sinking other people's ships. That's about all they're good for. And if I were concerned about the sorts of things that the government says it's concerned about, then I might conclude that a larger number of medium-sized surface ships might be a whole lot more useful to me and would certainly cost a whole lot less. So that's sort of part number one of the calculation. Part number two of the calculation is that if you are into subs, if you decide that, well, we really do need to have submarines, and again, these are not nuclear submarines, these are essentially attack submarines. That if you're not having a nuclear submarine, then the only other kind of submarine there is an attack submarine, a submarine designed to sink other people's ships. Then you want one which is extremely quiet. And it turns out that actually the most advanced conventional submarines are actually quieter than nuclear submarines. So if you're after the best thing for sending, I don't know, maybe a Chinese aircraft carrier to the bottom, then an advanced conventional sub might be a whole lot better way to do it than a nuclear one. Now, obviously, the Chinese nuclear subs are a bit noisier than the Russian or the American ones. But still, I suspect that at both stages of that decision-making process, the government has in fact made the wrong choice. Now, what one can argue that it is a way of pushing the door open to a wider adoption of nuclear technology. There's been a huge debate within Australia about the adoption of nuclear technology. And the conclusion, by and large, has been that the Australian public just doesn't want to know about it.
Well, hold on. Now you're talking about nuclear power stations, reactors for power.
I'm talking about nuclear power stations.
And why would the public not want to know about it?
Well, because we've concluded that they're expensive and that they're dangerous. Basically, a government that announced that it was going to build a bunch of nuclear power stations would immediately fall.
Oh, okay.
People really don't want to know about it. Now, the possibility that we're going to sort of get that in by stealth that we're going to say, well, we've got nuclear-powered submarines, so we need to have a test reactor or whatever. I can just see that coming, trailing along in the wake of the nuclear submarines, which are also a whole lot more expensive than conventional ones would be, and maybe less reliable than conventional ones would be. So, you know, I can see a whole bunch of reasons why, from a purely strategic point of view, if you got to have subs, then an advanced conventional sub. Indeed, the French submarines that we were lined up to have before this announcement happened, may well have been a far more sensible choice than the choice that we've just made.
There are so many things that make China look bad and look,
it's profoundly escalatory as well. If you want to have a confrontation with China, we are indeed going about it the right way. Now, I agree that for the last 10 years, China has been a more difficult partner than they used to be. China used to talk about win-win outcomes and that sort of thing. You don't get any language like that now. Instead, you get this wolf warrior diplomacy, which I am not sort of real enthusiastic about. It seems to be simply a mirror image of the kind of diplomacy that Donald Trump would have engaged in on the US side. So, you know, I think that what we're doing is we are taking a bad situation and making it worse.
Yeah, very likely. I think okay, I want to switch gears completely and talk about something absolutely out of this world, or I hope it stays out of this world, and that's EMP. The first time I paid attention to your name was when Aaron Tovish told me that I should talk to you about the electromagnetic pulse issue, and that you had talked to him about it, and I guess scared him enough to think that I should worry about it too. So you're hereby invited to worry me about EMPs. And all I know is when I mention it, other people start talking about something called the Carrington event, which is apparently a natural precursor of what this technological event would amount to. So start at the top, sir, and tell me why we should be scared.
Okay. Well, I remember a workshop at the UN about what would be the effects of a single nuclear weapon on, and it was basically on a particular city. And someone said, oh, we have to consider the effects on the global financial system. And based upon what I had been reading at that stage about electromagnetic pulse, I stuck my hand up and said, look, you don't actually have to nuke a city. If you explode your weapon 400 k's out in space above your city, assuming it's located in the continental United States or continental Europe, then you will short out every piece of electronic equipment underneath you without necessarily incinerating one human being or starting a fire anywhere or anything, or without necessarily even people looking up and saying, oh, there's been a big flash in the sky. But just suddenly everything stops working. Now, what actually happens is that when that nuke goes off 400 k's out in space, the gamma rays that it produces strip the electrons off the atoms in the very outermost layer of the Earth's atmosphere. And the electrons spiral down magnetic lines of force in ways that are far too complicated for me to get my head around either. And they do indeed short out anything electronic underneath that is not fairly heavily shielded. Now, shielding against EMP was something that used to be done in the 1980s. It's not technologically a huge challenge, but it costs money and it makes things more bulky because you've got to sheathe them in metal and you've got to earth it.
What all would you sheathe in metal? Things around the household, or what all? I mean, you can't do everything. What is critical?
First of all, you'd sheath your communication systems in metal. Unless, of course, your communication systems are optical fibre, in which case they're immune to EMP. But you'd want to sheath everything that had a microchip in it, in metal, right?
A lot of microchips around.
There's a lot of microchips around, exactly. And somebody did a bunch of experiments with the Department of Defense EMP test bed, in which they put cars on the EMP test bed and saw whether or not the car was affected by electromagnetic pulse. And yeah, it shorts out cars. So your ultimate nightmare scenario is one in which your car won't start. You have no power. That means you also have no water and no gas, right? When you go to the ATM to take money out, then the ATM won't be working. But don't worry, because your bank account has disappeared, because that's electronic too. Now, when we talk about the effect of a nuclear explosion on the global financial system, we tend not to take on board the scenario in which the entire global financial system simply goes poof, because all the records are kept electronically.
What about things that are on hard disks backed up? They're put away someplace. So
it depends again on shielding. It is simple to shield it, and in the 80s this was done so that nuclear command and control systems in particular were heavily shielded back in the 1980s. The same nuclear command and control systems are now routed through AT&T and Marvell. And the heavily shielded, but somewhat costly and a bit clunky backup systems have been largely abandoned. So you're looking at a situation in which even the military is way more vulnerable than it used to be.
Now, I had the idea that it was only half of the world. In other words, the part of the world that was exposed to this flash would be affected, but the other side.
That's correct. It's not even. I mean, it's a continent-sized area. So if you explode your nuke sort of roughly above the geometric center of the United States, you will knock out the United States, but you probably won't knock out, say, South America or Australia or Europe. So
okay, now suppose
knock out the entire world, you could probably use, say, 5 nukes. And apparently they don't have to be particularly big nukes. They just have to be good at producing lots of gamma rays.
Suppose they do. Russia wants to get the U.S. or the U.S. wants to get China or something. So we knock it out above China or Russia, or vice versa.
Well, you probably need several to knock out. I mean, you'd be talking about knocking out Eurasia. And the danger is you knock out Western Europe as well.
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
How probably need 3 or 4 or 5, something like that. But again, you're not talking about huge nukes, and you're talking about numbers that are less than 10.
Yeah, I'm thinking about side effects for the moment. if you knocked out just the Wall Street, let's say you could pinpoint it, and you could just knock out the heart of Wall Street, so 10 of the biggest, the exchange, stock exchange, and the places, 10 or so of these things. Now, if the effect,
with 400 Ks out in space, you're not going to have that precision.
okay, but if they could, I'm just trying to think of how segregated the different sectors of society are. Wouldn't the effect be worldwide anyway? If you knocked out Wall Street, and there's money sloshing around the world that comes from Australia and back and forth every day to Wall Street, wouldn't that in itself have a catastrophic effect on any of the other countries?
Well, I mean, a software glitch could do that. And there are EMP devices that are not nuclear weapons, and that operate at ground level, whose effects are much more localized. But no one's actually seen fit to use them as a weapon. Mm-hmm. Now, you also need to think in terms of, for example, if you have a conventional battle happening involving, say, tanks, the tank armor immediately shields from EMP, right? It's thick metal. It's going to the EMP was not going to penetrate. So, you know, you have to understand the limitations of this as well. But civilian systems in particular are not shielded. And you also look at the effects of very long transmission lines for electric grids. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is where the Carrington effect comes roaring in, because the Carrington effect, the Carrington event was a solar mass ejection in which a large amount of ionized particles is basically blasted at the Earth by the sun. Now, the sun does this all the time. It has periods when it does it a lot, and it has periods when it does it only a little bit. But it's not quite so often that it scores a direct bullseye on part of the Earth where a lot of people live. Now, in 1859, when this particular event happened, it's named after a guy called Carrington who actually saw it coming in a telescope. And so he was able to say, sort of 2 hours before the event actually took place, look, something is going to hit the Earth, which might be a little spectacular. And there were indeed there were spectacular auroras at the poles and even getting towards the equator, where you just don't sort of normally have auroral displays. And the global telegraph system went down. So telegraph operators were electrocuted. Telegraphs operated when they weren't connected to anything and then shorted out, and telegraph stations caught fire and burnt down. But, you know, back in those days, nothing much was connected to the telegraph. Mm-hmm. The global financial system did not depend on the telegraph for its existence, for its record keeping. So the telegraph might have taken 3 to 6 months to fix, and everybody just went on with their lives. If the same thing happened now, then the results for our highly wired society would be absolutely catastrophic. A quick trip back to the 18th century when you're not prepared for it would indeed mean that most citizens of societies like the United States, like Australia, like Europe, like Japan, would, well, I mean, your US congressional inquiry concluded that 9 out of 10 US citizens might actually starve to death in the wake of an event like that. And that's something that doesn't require a lot of nukes. It can be achieved with 1 or maybe 5 if you want to be sort of global, or it can happen out of purely natural events.
Like another sunspot from the sun. Yeah. And so we should be prepared. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we should be prepared. We're not.
Yeah.
We tend to say, well, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. It will cost money to prepare for it. Again, there are ways that national grids can be protected against geomagnetic storms. And you've produced a dozen inquiries, and they've all detailed the technical measures that are necessary as spark arresters. There's certain things that have got to be done to those really big transformers, which blow up and short out in that sort of situation. Otherwise, they haven't been done because they cost a bit of money, they're fiddly, they're messy, and no one can be bothered to do them. And it might not happen. We might be lucky. Or maybe not.
I connect that to something else, which sounds as if the effects are going to be very similar, and that is to the effect of the Internet of Things, that everything about the Internet is going to be connected to everything else, and therefore it would be possible for a malevolent person to knock out, all the cars on the road, or unlock the doors to everybody's house, or turn on the electric oven and et cetera. All these things that could be done without the intention of the owners.
Indeed so. And if you connect everything up to the internet, what happens if the internet stops working?
Exactly. Well, I know somebody who's very concerned about that as an existential threat. Our hobby is
what I call techno-fragility.
Yeah.
And there are a whole bunch of threats like that, but they all amount to that as the technology gets more complex, it becomes harder to control, it becomes vulnerable, it becomes harder to fix, and there are more people depending on it. But let me just give you, this will really, you're really going to love this. Electrical supply frequency and load matching is now done via the internet. It used to be done by dedicated analog systems, which always worked, and which, if they didn't work, were extremely fixable. But it now goes through the internet. But the internet depends on the electricity supply to work. So if the internet goes down, within a day or so, the electricity supply will also go down because it can't do frequency and load matching. But with the electricity supply down, it is no longer possible to get the internet back up.
Catch-22.
It's the old bootstrap thing, right? Now, if you had what we had in the 80s, if you had a parallel analog system, a little bit clunky but fixable, you could get the electricity supply back up, and then you could get the internet back up.
Okay, I have friends who talk about the need for an agency or an office at the United Nations that is dedicated to exploring and noticing and responding to existential threats. And that means just making a list for starters of problems such as this, where you get into that problem and there's no obvious solution. You're sunk. And we talked
Well,
about
there is an obvious solution. We had the solution in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right. We had a system that wouldn't happen to.
Well, we need, I think, an outfit that has the sole purpose of looking after problems that are of this magnitude. That once it happens, is game over. You can't play around with these problems. There are 6 or 8 of them. I can name a few, and you've already named one.
large incoming space objects.
Yes.
Gamma ray bursts in adjoining parts of the galaxy. I mean, there are some that we can't do too much about.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite for sheer theological overkill and hubris is experiments in artificial universe creation. You would not want such an experiment to work, because it would cause the entire galaxy to disappear in a blaze of exotic particles.
All right. I don't think I've heard of that one.
It's something that physicists, especially theoretical physicists, and people that work at the Large Hadron Collider, do need to keep a bit of a watching brief on. And it has been surmised that some, at least, of the quasars that we're now seeing are civilizations in which major physics experiments have gone wrong.
Oh dear. All right. Well, it's always an interesting thing to me to see how we're going to end up a show. I always like to do it with a cheerful piece of news, something up
after this.
But the end of the world was one of the bad ones. But you've even gone beyond that. You're talking about the end of the galaxy. Okay. Well, I'll think about it, and let's see if we can solve that one next time we get together. All right.
And I think that the more modest and more able to be tackled, I mean, all of these things are actually things that we can either fix or just not do, including the physics experiment in artificial universe creation. If we're sufficiently wise and sufficiently careful, we won't do anything stupid. If we're unwise and we go in like cowboys, then we may say, oh, there's not really any risk. Oops.
Thank you, John Hallam. This has been fun, and I look forward to the next time we get together. Let's do it with Aaron. Okay?
Yeah, it'll be great to do it with you.
All right. Thanks so much. This has been very, very interesting.
It's been fun. Thanks.
Carry on. Bye-bye.